Well, thank you to the Lancaster Bible College Choir for leading us in the anthems. I'm really excited to introduce our guest to you tonight, and I anticipate that some of you are going to have questions related to what she shares with us about justice in an unjust Middle East. So we have two ways. First of all, let me ask that you not interrupt her with questions during her talk tonight to us. But we do have two ways for you to submit questions tonight. We're going to take advantage of technology. It's actually okay to get your phone out and do a little texting during the program if you have a question. And up on the screen, you will see the instructions for texting. Any questions that you have, you enter 258-281 and your question and send it to 22333. And it will be received by us and we will have those questions. Now, for those of you that really don't know how to text with a phone, we have another way to ask questions, the old-fashioned way. And after Brooke is done speaking this evening, we will pass out forms to anybody that wants to write out a question, and then we'll collect those from you before we do the question and answer time. We just witnessed a major conflict between Israel and Hamas, the terrorists of Gaza. It's a war that lasted for 50 days, and we were saddened to see the extensive loss of life on both sides. There were 71 Israelis that were killed as a result of that conflict, and I reported 2,000 in Gaza, although those numbers are still being verified. But we were also outraged when we saw Hamas once again using innocent civilians as human shields, many of them children. I've heard firsthand testimonies from soldiers who were fighting in Gaza who said that the terrorists would pick up children and literally hold them to their bodies as shields to keep Israeli soldiers from firing at them. That, whether you realize it or not, that is a war crime. But we don't need to know it's a war crime to know that that is a great injustice and a tragedy. Wars are never just, but such injustice really pales our imaginations. And the Middle East seems to be a place of rampant injustice. At the same time, our media seems blind to most of what goes on over there. So tonight we have an expert in justice to address us on this issue of justice in an unjust Middle East. Brooke Goldstein is a New York City-based human rights attorney, author, and award-winning filmmaker. She serves as director of the Lawfare Project, a non-profit organization dedicated to raising awareness about and facilitating a response to the abuse of the Western legal system and human rights law. Brooke is also the founder and director of the Christian Rights Institute, a nonprofit organization whose mission is to track, spotlight, and legally combat violations of children's basic human rights around the world. The Christian Rights Institute has a special focus on the state-sponsored indoctrination and recruitment of children to become suicide, homicide bombers, child soldiers, and human shields. Brooke's first book, co-authored with Aaron Eitenmeyer and entitled Lawfare, The War Against Free Speech, a First Amendment Guide for Reporting in an Age of Islamist Lawfare, gives practical guidance to the journalists who wish to speak truthfully about the national security threats faced by liberal democracies. Brooke's award-winning documentary film, The Making of a Martyr, uncovers the illegal state-sponsored indoctrination and recruitment of Palestinian children for suicide, homicide attacks. Filming Martyr, Brooke secured first-hand interviews with active and armed members of the Al-Aqsa, Fatah, Islamic Jihad, and Hamas terrorist groups, as well as with families of suicide bombers, children imprisoned for attempting to blow themselves up, teachers at terrorist-run schools, and others involved in the phenomenon of child suicide bombing. Martyr is currently broadcast on television stations throughout the globe. Brooke is a regular commentator on Fox News. You may have, when you see her tonight, you're going to recognize her if you watch Fox News or some of the other major news outlets where she has been featured. She also is a seasoned public speaker, has lectured and taught seminars in numerous schools. Please give Brooke Goldstein a very warm Friends of Israel welcome. Brooke.
introduction, I just want to make one correction. It's the Children's Rights Institute. Though valuing human life is a Christian value as much as it is a Judeo value, it's certainly not an Islamist value, and that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. But I specifically want to thank Jim so much for making this happen. And of course Lisa Grosso and Steve Herzig and Chris Katolka bringing me here, making the arrangements. It is, there's no other word but to describe an honor to be before you, to know that the Jewish people have friends like you is in a sea of enemies is a feeling that really one cannot describe. I actually did not know that the Friends of Israel started by giving aid and shelter to those who were fleeing from Holocaust persecution. And my grandmother is a survivor of the Holocaust. She's actually recently deceased. And she was sheltered after running away from a concentration camp by a Christian family in France. So it's beyond gratitude that we owe your community. So thank you very much for having me. I'd like to start off the presentation with the opening scene of my documentary film, The Making of a Martyr, which, as Jim mentioned, takes a look at the egregious practice of the use of children as human shields, as suicide bombers, and as child soldiers in the Palestinian context. So, can we please play clip number 1? Supposed to do a dance. There were no waterfalls in the West Bank. Hamas got rid of those. So I was in my second year of law school when I first heard about Hussam Abdu, the 15-year-old, physically handicapped, rumored to be mentally handicapped, would-be boy bomber. And at that time, I happened to be taking a class called Human Rights in the Child. And we were learning about all of the treaties and the international conventions that made up the international legal system. We were learning about the UN Charter, we were learning about the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and all of the lofty principles contained therein. Every child has a right to life. Every child has a right to a media and education free of incitement to violence. And I came home and I turned on the TV, and literally broadcast right before me was this image of a 15-year-old dwarf. He's a physical dwarf with a bomb belt around his waist and his arms in the air. And it turned out that 48 hours before, Hussam Abdu was recruited by the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades, which is a Palestinian terrorist group who at that point had recruited up to 17 child suicide bombers who had detonated themselves and were responsible for dozens of other adult suicide bombers and hundreds of innocent dead civilians. They paid Hussam the equivalent of $20 to take his own life. They filmed him for a farewell video, which is the custom of Islamist terrorists. They took his picture for a martyr poster, so his image was to be printed after his death, celebrating his death. And they told him not to tell his parents what he was about to do. 2 days later, Al-Aqsa picked him up, the adults picked him up from his house, they drove him to the Hawara checkpoint, which is just outside of Nablus, and they instructed him to blow up amongst the Palestinian civilians waiting online to get into Israel. But fortunately for them, and fortunately for the IDF soldiers, the Israeli Defense Forces soldiers who were manning that checkpoint, Hussam proved smarter than the adults who recruited him because he chose life over death. He chickened out. He turned himself in. He was subsequently arrested by the IDF. He was tried and convicted of attempted murder, and he was sentenced to 8 years in prison at the Hasharon prison, which is about 45 minutes outside of Jerusalem. Now, I mentioned that I was in law school at this time, and it occurred to me that there was a legal argument here that certainly wasn't being made by his defense team, and it wasn't being made by the media or the politicians that were covering or commenting on this case. And that is that the child suicide bomber, him or herself, is as much a victim of a human rights crime as are, for example, child soldiers in Africa. Because the Muslim child suicide bomber, the Palestinian child suicide bomber in particular, is a product of a very shrewd brainwashing and recruitment strategy that literally targets children from infancy and teaches them through their school textbooks, by their teachers, by their television, radio, and print media, through their political leaders, by their religious leaders, that the greatest thing that they should aspire to is to blow themselves up for the sake of jihad. Now, I found this incredibly horrifying, and I decided that I was going to do something, and it was a frivolous decision, but I decided that I was going to travel to the West Bank, and I was going to raise $200,000, and I was going to make a documentary film about the subject. And the reason why I wanted to do this was, besides the fact that this is one of the most prevalent human rights abuses happening throughout the Islamist world that is not being covered by the media, which is the targeting of not just innocent children, but also Muslim women with the most egregious crimes. But this is the root cause of terrorism. Now, I was in New York City for 9/11, and what I noticed amongst my peers, and also amongst my teachers when I was at Columbia University, and also in the media, is everybody kept asking themselves, it was a very natural question, what did we do that they hate us so much? What did we do to deserve this? Why do they hate us so much? And that's the wrong question. The right question is, why are innocent Muslim children being taught to hate life and to love death? So over the next 2 years, and at great personal risk, and if there's any students in this audience, I do not condone this type of behavior, I traveled to Jenin, Ramallah, Tulkam, and Nablus, and as Jim mentioned, I secured first-hand interviews with leaders of Islamist terrorist organizations, families of both child and adult suicide bombers. I went into Israeli prisons, and I interviewed children who had been caught attempting to blow themselves up or participating in violent activities, to get to the root of this issue and expose it for the world to see. One of the first interviews we did, was with Hussam Abdu's parents. We filmed them in their living room. And what we captured was something very unique. We captured Hussam's mother crying to us on camera, condemning what her son did, and admitting to us on camera that there's no way that Hussam could have done this on her own. Now, in the Palestinian territories, especially in Gaza, if you are seen not towing, or if you are heard or speaking to the media and you're not towing the Islamist party line, you are accused of being a collaborator, and you are dealt with accordingly. You are executed. And we all know what happened. I mean, a bus just came out yesterday admitting that 120 Palestinians were executed by Hamas during the current conflict because they were accused of being collaborators. And we captured this very rare interview with Hussam's mom admitting to us on camera that she did not approve of what he was doing and that it was adults who were responsible for manipulating her child. Hussam's sister, on the other hand, it was a completely different story. For her, she had a brother who was marginalized as a teen. He was teased by his classmates. We actually found out that he wasn't mentally handicapped. In the West Bank, there's no political correctness in the Islamist society. If you have any type of physical deformity, if you're physically a dwarf, you're also considered to be mentally handicapped. So when we went in to do the interview, I was expecting Hussam Abdu, who would completely be there. But that was 100% not the case. But Hussam's sister was so embarrassed of her brother that when he did something like this, he became a hero. And she held up for us a lucite frame with a certificate from Hamas, a printed piece of paper, showing us how proud she was. So for her, the life of her brother was basically worth a piece of plastic and paper. And it was the first time that we encountered the disparity, the generational disparity, where on one hand, you had adults who would talk to you off camera, who did not condone the use of their own children, like any other parents in the world would not condone the murder of their own children. And then you had this next generation of teenagers and children who were more than willing to blow their limbs to pieces very, very violently because they honestly believe that they're going to be rewarded in paradise, as you saw in Hussam's clip. We also interviewed the mother of Wafa Idris. Wafa Idris is the first female Palestinian suicide bomber. She blew herself up in a crowded Jerusalem marketplace. She killed one person and she injured 100 more. After her murderous death, schools were named after Wafa Idris in the Palestinian territories. There was a parade every year that's held in her honor, with children marching in the front, carrying a fake coffin and pictures of Wafa Idris. And we interviewed her mom. Her mom was sat in the first floor of what was a two-story building. The second story of the building was demolished by the Israeli Defense Forces because it is their custom to demolish the houses of terrorists. When I actually interviewed Hussam Abdu, one of the questions we asked him was, why did you turn yourself in? And he said to me, because I was worried if my house should be demolished. So it was a deterrent factor in his sense. And when we interviewed Wafa Idris's mom, she said to us, you know, my heart mourns my daughter, but my head tells me it was the right thing to do. That was her way of speaking to us on camera, towing the party line, but still saying, you know, I really miss my daughter, I mourn for her. But then we interviewed Wafa Idris's nieces outside the family home. Steve, let's play that clip, please.
حبيبنا الحرية بدنا احنا نروح ونيجي، احنا محسوب علينا مش عارفين نروح ولا نيجي، وين ما نروح محسوب ما رحناش ولا محل، انا كثير انه طلبت من امي انا بحب اني اعمل عملية استشهادية، بس انه امي تقول امي لا خليكي إلنا، يعني إنه إنك تعمل عملية استشهاد كيف تروح عليك واليهود يعني إجا ماتوا 40 ولا 50 تعودوا يرجعوا من البيت. أنا كنت في المستشفى، أنا كنت أقول مش مسؤولية بالغاز،
Outside Wafa's home, graffiti serves as a reminder. We congratulate our hero Wafa on her martyrdom operation. Congratulations to our martyr, Wafa Idris, and to all our blessed martyrs. Let our resistance continue until victory is achieved. Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades, Fatah.
Now, it turns out that Wafa was divorced, she was barren, and she was threatened with an honor killing. So instead of being stoned publicly, which is the punishment for women under Sharia law, she chose instead to blow herself up and thereby, again, bring honor to her family. Now this dispels the notion that we often hear in the media, the very anti-Israel media. Well, what can the Palestinians do? It's out of desperation. How are they supposed to resist? This is the only thing left to them, is blowing themselves up, as though this is some sort of natural occurrence of a population that's fighting for their civil rights, is to blow themselves up and to blow their women and children up. But that's certainly not the case with Wafa, and it's certainly not the case with the children who are being manipulated and bribed to do this. Now, often I did not believe that what my translator was telling me was an accurate translation coming out of these children's mouths. I mean, they're beautiful, young, articulate, loving, friendly children, and yet the words that come out of their mouths, I want to be a martyr, I want to be a suicide bomber, I hate Jews. It was unbelievable to me, and I thought to myself, what is going on? What is responsible for this type of indoctrination that's so powerful that even the parents telling them, no, is not working? Well, we had a chance to visit the Islamic Jihad Academy, which is one of dozens of schools in the West Bank that are run by designated terrorist groups. And the curriculum is basically implicit in the name, Islamic Jihad, the Holy War Academy. And their children wore green hats as part of their uniforms that say, God is great and death to the infidels. Now, usually when I talk about my experiences, someone in the audience jumps up right about now and says, that's not true, that's a lie. But I encourage everyone in this audience to see for themselves. Every story, every anecdote that I am telling you right now has been documented in the movie, The Making of a Martyr. So if you don't believe me, you can see it for yourselves. At the Islamic Jihad Academy, we asked the teachers to put a panel up of children who they thought were the best and the brightest children. And we asked them, is peace with Israel possible? One child said, if Allah wills it, it will be. And that child was immediately interrupted by another child and said, peace impossible. It's either death or victory. It's jihad or martyrdom. After which the teachers laughed and encouraged the children, and one teacher said, reminds me of my own son. This is all documented. We also went to a local kindergarten, and we put the children in a circle, and we played a game with them called, what do you want to be when you grow up? And every child that we went around to, and I'm talking about 3, 4-year-old children, said shaheed, shaheed, which is the Arabic word for martyr, suicide bomber. One child said teacher, after which the teacher immediately instructed the child to say, no, you don't want to be a teacher, you want to be a shaheed too. And the child answered in line. So how is it, beyond just the curriculum, how are the children being fed a steady diet of hatred? Well, we have to look no further than Palestinian Authority TV. Let's play that clip, please.
حكيت عن الشهادة كشيء جميل، أنت بتعتقد إنه شيء جميل؟
الشهادة كتير شيء جميل جدا جدا، كل الناس بتتمنى الشهادة. أيوة. لأنه يعني إيش في أحلى من إنك تروحي على الجنة. ماشي، يسرا أنت راضية بالكلام هذا؟
طبعا الشهادة أحلى، لأنه إحنا هلا مش الدنيا بدنا الآخرة. أيوة. مش الدنيا اللي حتفيدنا الآخرة.
خليني أسألك سؤال بصراحة، هل أنتم بطبعكم بتحبوا الموت؟
في فرق بين الموت والشهادة.
لا الآن أنا بحكي عن الغياب بمعنى الموت، الغياب الجسدي. هل أنتم فعلا بتحبوا الموت؟
ما فيش أطفال بتحب الموت، لكن أطفال فلسطين أخذوا فكرة إنه هذه شهادة، إنه عندهم مثلا إنه الموت شهادة، وهذا إشي كتير كويس. إنه مثلا كل طفل فلسطيني ولد مثلا قلنا عمره 12 سنة يلا بس تشهد.
Let's stop it after this because I know we're short on time. I just want to point out that, by the way, is Yahya Barakat, who is the chief programmer of Palestine Authority TV, and he's on the salary of the PA. Guess who pays PA salary? U.S. taxpayer dollars with all of our grants. Also notice how smart Yusra is. She's so smart that she corrects the adult. Death isn't martyrdom. You don't die when you blow your limbs to pieces. You go to paradise, and that's quite a lovely concept, and all children agree. Who wouldn't want to go to paradise? That is the extent of the indoctrination, that they're at the point where they're even correcting the adults on their own Islamist doctrine. Now, we were able to secure an interview with Zachariah Zubaydi, who is the leader of the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades at that time in Jenin. He was the #1 most wanted man by the Israelis. Now, when I asked him, how can you possibly justify recruiting children as young as 10 years old to become suicide bombers? And he told me, well, if I don't give them a belt, they'll just use a knife instead. That is a verbatim quote that he gave me, indicating that the level of indoctrination is so severe that he's just doing them a favor. That's how he justifies it. And when I said to him, what would you do if a parent tried to stop you? He said, well, I'd accuse them of being a collaborator. And again, we know what that means. We also had the chance, finally, to meet with the leaders of the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades in Tulkam. The night before, the leaders were assassinated by the IDF in a counterterrorism operation. So instead, we met with the militants, or the terrorists, who had risen in the ranks and who had taken their place. Let's play that clip, please.
يعني عندنا مثلا كل يعني شباب دعوة موجود، بعدين احنا عندنا صغير صغير احسن من الكبير. يعني ليش؟ يعني بقاوم الولد الصغير يعني خلص عنده مناعة، فيش عنده مناعة على انه ما يقاومش الجيش. يعني مناعته قوية انه يقاوم الجيش. ليش كان عمرك؟ 12 سنة. 12 سنة. شو كنت تجرب؟ ليش؟ كنت أنا 12 سنة. 16 سنة. 17. أنا في لي أصحاب كثير استشهدوا، وأثروا علي كثير أصحاب يعني عزوا علي، وعشان هيك أنا عاهدتهم إني أمشي على طريق النضال معهم، أضل مستمر في طريق المشي ومش مفكر بالمدرسة ولا التوجيه، بس إني أقاوم الجيش الإسرائيلي. تخاف من الموت؟ لا. كلنا بنحب الشهادة.
والعمليات مثلا الأطفال الصغار، أنتم اليوم بيجيكم بتشوفوا أطفال عمرهم 13 12 سنة كمان بيحبوا ينزلوا عمليات معهم حسابات ينزلوا عمليات. بتأيدوا العمل هذا؟
كل شيء حسب القناعة.
يعني حتى لو كان عمره 13
حتى لو كان عمره 10 سنين، هو شو قناعته البني آدم، شو قناعته شو بيعمل. قناعته هو مثلا بيجي بني آدم بقول لك أنا تعال أنزل عملية استشهادية، تقدرش تقول له لا.
This is the so-called Palestinian resistance movement. While the leaders sit in Qatar, while they send their kids to private schools abroad, while they pocket millions of dollars, they recruit child soldiers to act as political pawns for their Islamic jihad aimed at one thing. Not a civil rights struggle for the Palestinian people, but the genocide and destruction of the Jewish people and the state of Israel through mutual annihilation, suicide, homicide, violence. Now, when I released the film, the most ironic thing happened to me. We ended up winning the Audience Choice Award for Best Film at the United Nations Documentary Film Festival. Now, why is this ironic, you ask? Well, for a couple reasons. Number one, because even though the United Nations has issued over 100 resolutions condemning Israel, can anyone tell me how many UN General Assembly or Human Rights Council resolutions they've issued condemning the murder of Palestinian children in this form? One guess, 0. Exactly. Do you even know that the United Nations General Assembly has not even authored a resolution that defines the crime of terrorism? There is not one resolution defining the crime of terrorism, and why is that? Because the United Nations is basically a democracy of a bunch of totalitarian dictatorships who have banded together under the outfit called the OIC, the Organization of the Islamic Cooperation, which is a 57-member voting bloc, and have refused to pass any definition of terrorism that doesn't exclude the targeting of American and Israeli civilians. Also, it's ironic because the United Nations runs schools under its umbrella UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency, which is the arm of the UN that provides aid and education in the West Bank. UNRWA officials have come out and admitted to hiring Hamas as teachers. They have come out in this conflict admitting to hiding rockets in UNRWA schools. They have admitted in this current conflict to handing over rockets to terrorists. They have admitted to bringing Al-Qutla al-Islamiyah, which is Hamas's youth wing, into the UNRWA school to recruit children as child soldiers within UNRWA schools. Now, can anyone tell me who the #1 largest donor to UNRWA is, giving over $200 million last year, giving $1.2 billion since its founding? The United States. So all in all, your taxpayer dollars are going towards aiding and abetting the premeditated murder of Palestinian children in the various ways that I mentioned to you. And once I released the film, I was fortunate enough to travel to film festivals and to speak about this topic, and I became the de facto expert on Islamist terrorism vis-a-vis the recruitment of children. Why? Because nobody else was talking about it. So I thought, well, I better do my research here. And what I found out is that this phenomenon is in no way restricted to the West Bank or Gaza. It's in no way restricted to the so-called Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Rather, the recruitment and indoctrination of Muslim children towards violence is happening throughout the Muslim world, and it's happening here in the West too. In Pakistan, the Taliban had kidnapped over 1,000 children. They were offering $12,000 to parents per child that they would then take. They would put them in madrasas, and they would educate them how to become suicide bombers. ISIS right now, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or Levant as Obama likes to call them, has executed hundreds of children, including Christian children. It has kidnapped female Christian children. They are force converting them, and they are selling them as sex slaves to Islamist terrorists who are fighting. In Afghanistan, one of my friends in the US military told me that militants stole infants from hospital beds, placed them on IEDs, which are improvised explosive devices, because they knew that our forces, acting like normal human beings, would see an infant crying at the side of the road, would pick that infant up, and they would both detonate together. In Iraq, a child with Down syndrome was recruited and blown up by remote control. At a U.S. coalition force checkpoint, 2 children were left in the backseat of a truck and also blown up by remote control. And of course, we know what happens in Lebanon. We have over 42,000 child soldiers in Lebanon being trained by Hezbollah under the same umbrella as the Boy Scouts of America, by the way. This is a story that I just pitched to Fox News, and hopefully they'll take it. And yet, despite the fact that this egregious human rights violation is happening out in the open, no human rights organizations have consistently, coherently condemned the practice. In fact, the Coalition to Stop the Use of Child Soldiers, the same year that my movie came out, released a quote saying, "There is no evidence of the systematic recruitment of Palestinian children towards violence. Instead, what we're seeing is a coordinated legal attack aimed at Israel, whose sole purpose is to paint Israel Not the Islamist terrorists that's fighting, not the Islamist states, but Israel as the #1 human rights violator in the world as it's engaged in a battle for survival and self-defense. Because Israel's enemies know, and the media also knows, that Israel cannot be defeated on the battlefield, thank God. However, they can attempt to undermine Israel's willingness and capacity to defend herself through what we call lawfare means, the use of the law as a weapon of war. And how do we see this? And I know that we're short on time, so we'll end with a couple examples of this, and then we can get into a discussion. First and foremost, what we're seeing are dozens of war crimes charges against Israeli officials filed in Spain, in Belgium, in Switzerland, in New Zealand, in the UK, in Denmark, in Canada, that attempt to punish the elected officials of Israel while impeding their free movement across the European borders. We don't see the same war crimes charges against leaders of Hezbollah and Hamas and Qatar and Islamic Jihad who are freed across European borders with impunity. That's not justice, is it? We see, for example, the International Court of Justice declaring in its advisory opinion that Israel's security barrier, brick and mortar and fence, is a violation of international law. And that same court, in the same opinion, refused to enter into evidence the very relevant fact that the fence contributed to a sharp decline in the loss of human lives. The defense team was not allowed to enter that into evidence, nor were they allowed to present testimony from terror victims who were saved because of that fence. Now, why should we care? Well, if the ICJ declares Israel's fence a crime against humanity, what then is our border with Mexico? And should we even allow the ICJ, a kangaroo court with absolutely no due process, to even make those kinds of decisions? And finally, what we're seeing now is lawfare proponents declare any Jewish presence in Judea and Samaria illegal. Jews are not allowed to build homes in our ancestral homeland, but Christians are and Muslims are. This legitimizes the Islamist Nazi concept of a Judean state of Palestine and ignores Abbas's repeated calls that any Palestinian state will be free of Jews. And we know the misnomer, the illegal occupation of Palestinian land. Palestine is a geographic location. It is not an ethnicity. There is absolutely no difference between a Palestinian Arab ethnically or religiously and an Egyptian or a Jordanian or a Lebanese. Rather, Palestinian, to refer to Arabs, is a term that was invented by Yasser Arafat in the 1960s. Who knows where Yasser Arafat was born? Egypt. This is an educated ground. The majority of people who listen to the media would not know. They would think he was a native Palestinian, of course, who was displaced. So these are the legal terminologies and the lawfare attacks that are now being waged against Israel. So we'll end with this. What can we do? Well, first and foremost, the #1 most important thing to do is to exercise your right to free speech, to exercise your First Amendment right, to continue having gatherings like these, to continue bringing speakers who are going to shed light on what's really happening in the Middle East and the shared enemies that all citizens of liberal democracies face. And the second most important thing we must do is take back the justice system. We must empower lawyers to work pro bono and reduced rate, to file cases against the terror front organizations operating within our borders, the Hamas front organizations like the Council on American Islamic Relations that you'll see on CNN, for example, that are fomenting anti-Israel hate. We must take back the international legal system. We must file war crimes charges against the leaders of Islamist states. We must take back the term apartheid. We must highlight the gender, the sexual, the ethnic, the religious apartheid that is happening in every single Islamist state. And I ask you to meditate on one of my favorite quotes, and it's by Nelson Mandela. There can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way in which it treats its own children. Ask yourself today, what are we doing as a nation to protect the lives of innocent Muslim children? Because their futures are undeniably linked to ours. Thank you very much.
Brooke has such a passion for justice, and it's something that's so lacking today in our world, and I'm so appreciative of what you shared with us tonight, Brooke. She's not done. We are going to give you an opportunity to ask her some of the questions that are on your mind in relation to what she shared tonight. And so if you didn't text a question, but you still want to ask one, if you will raise your hand, one of the ushers will come around and give you a form that you can write out a question on. And so just keep your hand up until they get to you, if you would do that. While they're doing that, I want to mention to you that Brooke brought along the DVD that she mentioned, The Making of a Martyr. There's a table, just as you exit the center door here on the left, there is a table in the foyer. You can buy that DVD for $20. And this is going to tell the full story. Brooke had a chance to only give you a glimpse of some of what she was able to do. I'm just amazed, Brooke, that you had the chutzpah to go into the West Bank and Gaza and record all this. I mean, it's just amazing what you were able to do. Also, the book Lawfare, The War Against Free Speech, the way that terrorist organizations are using the law to intimidate people, to overpower them. You know, you begin to take a stand and then they come after you with the law and they misuse the law. And so the Lawfare exposes that and gives insights into how we can defend against that. And you know, you may think, well, that doesn't affect me, but it's coming. We need to wake up as a country. We need to wake up. Listen, the terrorists are making threats, and they're not veiled threats. We have porous borders. And some of the things you will see on this DVD and that Brooke shared tonight may be coming to America in the near future. And I'm not trying to scare you, I'm just trying to say that we need to be aware of that. And so this book is $10, the back table. Brooke, after we're done tonight, is going to be at the table, so if you would like the book signed or you want to visit with her for a few minutes, she'll be there and glad to talk with you tonight. So, have we gotten the forms out to everyone? Okay, if we have, I'm going to ask the ushers to come. We are going to take up a collection to help offset some of the expenses for tonight. It's a voluntary offering, and if you feel led to give to the expenses tonight, we would appreciate that. While the offering is being taken, our music team is going to lead us in an offertory, and afterwards then John is going to lead us in a few songs while we collect these questions, and then Brooke and I will be back after that to entertain your questions. So, John?